Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a seriously fascinating topic, the intersection of ancient scripture and modern neuroscience. We're literally going to put ancient texts right next to modern biological discoveries, and honestly, the connections we're going to see are pretty mind-blowing. So, here's the big question to kick things off. Is neurobiology actually described in scripture? Did these ancient writers somehow anticipate what we now know about the brain? As we dig into the source material, we're going to see just how deeply our physical, biological experiences are tangled up with our spiritual ones, and how surprisingly well these ancient writings line up with modern science. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. First, emotions and the physical body. Second, anatomy of the inner man. Third, neuroscience meets the divine image. And finally, the dance of integration. Let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, emotions and the physical body. For a long time, we kind of treated the mind and the physical body as two totally separate things. But look at this comparison. Modern science tells us that intense emotions like anger literally send neurological impulses straight to your intestine, causing cramping and spasms. While thousands of years before anyone mapped the central nervous system or even coined the term brain-gut connection, ancient scripture noted the exact same thing. Proverbs 14:30 says passion is rottenness to the bones. They recognized back then that internal turmoil like anger or anxiety takes a very real degrading toll on your physical health. And to put into perspective just how massive this mind-body connection is, the sources highlight a pretty wild statistic. Around 60 to 80% of patients have physical symptoms that are actually just biological reactions to the stresses of life. 60 to 80%. So the physical ailments driving people to the doctor are overwhelmingly rooted in emotional and psychological distress. Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of the Inner Man. So if our physical bodies and inner lives are that connected, how do theological scholars actually map out the mind? In biblical counseling frameworks, it's broken down into three main faculties. You've got the intellect, which is how we think and reason, the will, our capacity to choose and act, and the emotions, our feelings. Now, the key takeaway here is that these aren't competing for control. They're totally interdependent. Your reasoning relies on your emotions, your choices rely on your intellect, and the biblical view argues they are all ultimately meant to work together as a unified whole. Which leads us to a really core theological concept called trichotomy. This is basically the belief that a human being isn't just a physical body, but a synthesis of three distinct parts: the body, the soul, and the spirit. In this model, the body interacts with the physical world, the soul houses your personality and mind, and the spirit is your specific capacity to connect with the divine. Now, to be clear, this is actually a massive point of debate among scholars. You've got trichotomists arguing for those three distinct parts: body, soul, and spirit. But on the flip side, dichotomists argue we're only made of two parts: the material body and the immaterial soul. They suggest that soul and spirit are really just interchangeable words for the exact same inner self. So there's definitely an ongoing academic conversation about how we are fundamentally wired. To help make sense of this, some scholars use a brilliant analogy straight out of neurobiology. They say the soul and the spirit are a lot like the left and right hemispheres of your brain. We know biologically that the left and right sides process information differently and have distinct functions, right? But they still operate together as one completely unified brain. Similarly, the soul and the spirit can have distinct theological functions while still being one unified immaterial self. It's a great way of using biology to anchor a pretty abstract theological idea. And when it comes to human struggles within that inner anatomy, the biblical counseling movement takes a very distinct stance. The text puts it like this: our core problem is sin, and the core resolution is awakening faith. This is a huge shift from secular psychology, which usually points to biology, environment, or trauma as the root of psychopathology. This framework, however, maintains that our fundamental issue is actually a spiritual condition, and that spiritual disconnect is what ultimately drives our psychological struggles. All right, Section 3, Neuroscience meets the divine image. So we've seen theology borrow from biology, but what happens when hard scientific facts actually challenge ancient theology? Well, let's look at a specific medical condition: aphasia. This is where someone loses the ability to use or comprehend words, usually because of physical brain damage, like a stroke. Keep this in mind because it actually triggered a major paradigm shift for religious scholars. Here's the story. Back in the late 1800s, a lot of theologians just assumed that being created in the image of God meant having the unique human ability to use complex language. But then, clinical studies of stroke victims with aphasia created a real crisis. These patients had entirely lost their language capabilities, but they were undeniably still fully human, retaining all their intrinsic dignity. Basically, neuroscience forced theology to step back and realize that the divine image exists completely independent of our linguistic skills. Science literally helped refine how they interpreted scripture. Our sources give us another wild medical analogy, this time comparing spiritual decay to a neurological disease called myasthenia gravis. In this condition, your brain sends a signal to move a muscle, but because the receptors, the motor end plates, are missing, the signal drops and the muscle just withers. The text compares this directly to a person's spiritual state. God's truth might be broadcasting loud and clear, but if there's a broken spiritual connection, if you're missing those spiritual receptors, so to speak, you simply can't receive the signal, leading to inner decay. It's fascinating how a physical, neurological failure maps so perfectly onto this theological concept. And that brings us to our final section, the dance of integration. To see how this is playing out today, look at this excerpt from Edward Welch's academic review of Everett Worthington's model of psychological integration. This isn't just old history. Scholars are actively debating right now about how to bridge the gap between clinical psychological science and a faith-based worldview. They're not trying to throw one out in favor of the other. They are actively reviewing how they can inform each other. In fact, Worthington lays out 4 really practical goals for doing this. He says clinical science can, 1, validate scriptural principles, just like we saw with anger and the gut. 2, spark new ideas for theological exploration, like the insights we got from stroke patients. 3, help us live wiser everyday lives. And 4, ultimately help us know God better. It's a model where clinical observation actually enriches spiritual understanding. And there's a reoccurring metaphor in the text that sums this dynamic up perfectly. Scripture is called to lead and science is called to follow, and yet there is a back and forth in good dancing. It's such a great image. It suggests that while faith might set the foundational worldview for these thinkers, science is an incredibly active, essential partner. Good clinical observations ask tough questions that refine theology. It's a continuous back and forth dance. Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Are science and faith truly at odds with each other? Or are they simply 2 totally different languages? One ancient and spiritual, the other modern and empirical, trying to describe the exact same, incredibly complex human experience. Thanks so much for tuning in to this explainer.